Good morning. I'd like to call to order this special emergency MTA August board meeting. We're conducting this meeting remotely via WebEx and conference call. Governor Cuomo's Executive Order 202.1, which has subsequently been extended, suspends the open meeting law requirements, and accordingly any provisions in the MTA bylaws regarding public attendance at meetings and board members participating and voting by phone are also suspended. I'd like to ask Tom Quigley, our General Counsel, to do the official roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Board members, I will now do the official roll call in alphabetical order. When I call your name, please verbally indicate your presence. If your microphone is on mute, please remember to unmute it before you respond. Chairman Pat Foy is in attendance. Andrew Albert.
Here.
Jamie Barbas.
Present.
Frank Borelli Jr.
Present.
Norman Brown.
Present.
Victor Calisi.
Present.
Lorraine Cortez Vasquez. I believe she indicated she'll be joining us late. Michael Fleischer.
Present.
Randy Glucksman.
Present.
Rhonda Herman.
Present.
David Jones. David Jones. I do see a DJ on the screen. David, are you with us? All right. Linda Lacewell.
Present.
Kevin Law.
Present.
Bob Lynn.
Here.
David Mack. David Mack.
Present. Present.
Ada Mahaltes.
Yeah.
Robert Mojica. Robert Mojica.
Present.
John Samuelson. John Samuelson. Larry Schwartz.
Here.
Vinny Tessitore.
Here.
Neil Zuckerman.
Here.
Okay. One more time. David Jones.
Here.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We will now move into our virtual comment period. As with the prior months, speakers were able to register on Monday and send in their comments. We will now play public comments for the next 30 minutes and make the full public comment video available online.
I'm on mute.
We have 19 members of the public registered to speak today. The first 30 minutes of public comment will be delivered at the board meeting, and the remainder will be posted online for the public and board members. I'd like to remind our public speakers that in the interest of time and fairness to all speakers, we limit everyone to 2 minutes. Please be aware that there will be a warning beep to remind you that you have 30 seconds to conclude your remarks. Thank you for your patience and understanding throughout the virtual public comment session. The next speaker is Senator Diane Savino.
Board members, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today. Our city and state have been through extraordinarily difficult times since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has affected all of us personally, and we now face dire economic difficulties in so many areas, including how we get around. Frankly, we need help. Help from our federal government that we already contribute so much to through our taxes. It is time for them to step up and ensure that they pass legislation that includes $12 billion in direct aid to the MTA. The consequences of not receiving additional funding mean extending hardship for years to come in our city. We cannot afford to lay off workers, we cannot afford to decrease services or institute fare and toll hikes. MTA workers have been on the front lines of this pandemic since it first began, putting themselves at risk to ensure that other workers, like our nurses, doctors, EMTs, and paramedics, have been able to get to work and to take care of their patients. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to make it through this. We cannot leave them out to dry now. Our residents depend on the MTA to get to and from work, and they're already struggling to keep their jobs through this pandemic. Decreases in services will make it more difficult for them to get around, and increased fares will make it harder to pay for other necessities like food and rent. We as legislators understand that there are going to be difficult financial times for years to come because of what we're going through right now. But that does not mean that we should wait to take action. We must be proactive and work with the federal government to ensure that essential services are able to continue functioning. The MTA is one of those essential services. Again, I thank you for your time, and I'm hopeful that we will find a solution to these financial struggles.
The next speaker is Senator Andrew Gennardis.
Hi, good afternoon. This is State Senator Andrew Gennardis. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak at the board meeting today. I want to start off my comments by thanking the tens of thousands of men and women who make up the MTA's workforce, who have done just an incredible job in keeping New York City moving forward and our region moving forward during the depths of the crisis, and who have not shied away for a second in doing whatever it takes to keep our system safe, secure, reliable for all. And I want you all to know that your service and your work is deeply appreciated by many in this city and in this state. I want to talk briefly about an issue that I think has a big impact on the future of that workforce, and that is the MTA's budget outlook and our fiscal crisis that we are facing. We all read the papers. We all know the MTA is facing dire financial circumstances through no fault of their own. The CARES Act funding has been expired. We urgently need federal assistance to the tune of at least $10 billion to help secure and stabilize the system and make sure that we do not have to lay off any of our employees or have to cut service to any part of our system. Laying off employees in this moment would be absolutely devastating, especially it would be adding insult to injury to those employees who did not have the luxury of Zooming their way through their workday and had to come to work every single day and be on the front lines. And if we don't get federal assistance, we will have to face debilitating service cuts to our system at a time when our city and our region simply cannot afford to stop moving forward. So please know that I am adding my voice to those who are calling on the federal government for immediate assistance. And my commitment to this board and to the riding public is to do everything in my power and use every tool at my disposal to keep pushing, arguing, pleading, begging for the federal aid that we so desperately need. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Senator Brad Hoylman.
Hello, I'm State Senator Brad Hoylman, representing the 27th Senate District. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comment during this difficult time. I know the MTA faces an extraordinary fiscal crisis, and I truly appreciate the MTA's staff and board's continued dedication to keeping New Yorkers connected and safe. The federal government's failure thus far to provide appropriate financial relief to address the effects of the massive drop in ridership caused by the pandemic is unconscionable and risks compromising our entire regional economy. However, while that failure has caused hardship and difficult choices, those burdens are shared by the MTA's small commercial tenants as well. Many retail businesses and restaurants in Grand Central Terminal are facing existential threats to their survival, and some have already closed for good. I know that the MTA has worked with those tenants in the past to waive certain penalties and defer rent payments from April to July, but they desperately need a long-term solution that addresses the struggles they face through no fault of their own due to state restrictions and loss of customers. Thus far, to my understanding, the MTA has not offered these tenants rent abatement or even had substantive discussions with some of them on this issue. And tenants recently received notices that not only will deferments and concessions end, but past due rent balances will now be subject to late fees and penalties. I urge the MTA to negotiate with its tenants in good faith and explore solutions that would recognize their drastically reduced revenue, including rent abatements. The deep structural financial problems caused by the pandemic will only be solved by a comprehensive federal response. Forcing these tenants, many of whom have been in business for a decade or more, to either pay their rent in full or close up shop will only cause deeper, more lasting damage to the economy and to our local communities without meaningfully addressing the MTA's financial issues. I hope the MTA will set an example for other agencies and the private sector by acknowledging their plight and working collaboratively with them in this time of deep uncertainty, and then building in corresponding requests for assistance from the federal government to address the costs borne by the authority to assist its tenants. If we can't do this as government, how can we in good faith be asking landlords across the city to do it? The answer isn't to not extend relief, it's to lead by example. The moment we're faced with leaves us with few good options, but it remains critical for us all to pull together as New Yorkers to do our best for riders, small businesses, and our transit system and recognize that our struggles are shared. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide comment.
The next speaker is Alita Dupree.
Good morning, Chair Pat Foy and members. Alita Dupree for the record. My pronouns are she and her. It's good to be back with you. First of all, I am pleased with the progress we're making with Omni fare payment. 2/3 of the station's done, and Manhattan buses as well. So let's keep this work going and get reduced fare passes into that protocol. It's going to help me and a lot of people. Accessibility is very important. You know, I go out for my walks and sometimes my feet get blistered. So I'm cognizant of walking. I'd like to see some kind of schematics with each of these stations in our system so we know where the various ramps and elevators are to navigate. Of course, Grand Central is a very big part of that. Continuing to keep that station maintained and clean. Continue the work with East Side Access. I'm looking forward to seeing that open up and have the opportunity to take the Long Island Railroad to the east side. Sustainability. I want to see a wind and solar powered subway. Emissions is a very critical issue, and it's going to take time. But I think that we can make the progress to reduce our carbon emissions. So again, I think about that MTA is legendary. I listened to another George Harrison song called Love Comes to Everyone. And it reminds me of Grand Central Terminal again. And I think the acoustics of Grand Central Terminal are great for music. So Grand Central is about the people. And it's a place near and dear to me. Discovered things bigger than myself. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. The next speaker is Rachel Faust.
Good morning. I'm Rachel Faust, Senior Research Analyst for reInvent Albany. We advocate for more transparent and accountable state government, including for authorities like the MTA. We are here to amplify what Chair Foy and others have been saying for months. The MTA faces financial destruction without a huge influx of federal emergency aid. There is no plan B that results in an economically and socially viable New York City. The U.S. Congress must deliver a huge emergency aid package with the more than $10 billion the MTA needs through 2021. Given your roles as members of the MTA board, we ask that you be prepared to address the possible scenarios for the future well ahead of the release of the November financial plan and the anticipated adoption of the 2021 budget in December. These times are unprecedented, and the earlier a public dialogue is created about the possible scenarios, the better all stakeholders can weigh in about what options will be the least harmful, both in the short and long term. Further, the consequences of congressional inaction will be made more stark. While we are encouraged to hear Chairman Foy say that deficit borrowing would be like going to the top of 2 Broadway and lighting $1 million bills and throwing them into Broadway, a true red line must be drawn on how much debt is too much for the MTA. With COVID ravaging the MTA's finances, debt payments will reach nearly 26% of operating revenues in 2021. This is up from 11% in 2004. The MTA must learn from the past and ensure that riders in future years aren't suffering under a transit system so saddled with debt it can't maintain service levels or a state of good repair. There should be an independent assessment of MTA debt conducted by the state comptroller and robust discussions by the board about how to mitigate debt payments. While it's a positive development, the MTA was able to borrow $450 million from the Federal Reserve Municipal Liquidity Program. And this borrowing still comes at a cost of 1.92% interest, must be paid back in 3 years, and only provides a nickel on the dollar of what the MTA needs to bridge the $10 billion gap. The Fed should significantly improve the program to include 0 or much lower interest rates over a longer period of time. Only they have the power to make a limited level of borrowing or debt refinancing a potentially viable option for the MTA. Similarly, Congress must deliver the $10 billion in emergency aid to the MTA, as the MTA cannot cut or borrow its way out of this deficit without devastating consequences for riders. Thank you for your time.
The next speaker is Jason Rabinowitz.
Thank you, members of the MTA board, for giving me an opportunity to speak today. I've watched many of these board meetings throughout the years, but I never quite felt the need to participate in the public comment process until right now. Public transportation is the heart and soul of New York City and the greater tri-state region as a whole. We all know that. I don't have to explain that. I'm here today to urge our elected leaders and every riding passenger to advocate for the critical federal funding needed to help MTA through this unprecedented financial crisis. Ridership is low right now, but we must ensure that there's still a functional transit system ready for an eventual return to normal life, and this can only happen with emergency federal funding. In recent years, the MTA has made really great strides in improving service, like speeding up slow-moving R trains to providing a real-time data and information that just a few years ago that was unthinkable, like real-time arrival information for trains and service change notices on new screens throughout the system. Many stations have had elevators installed after a century of denying riders with disabilities, and ancient signals are finally being replaced. We've come too far in recent years to throw all this progress away and let our public transportation system stagnate and, God forbid, deteriorate, undoing years of great progress. The city and region needs public transportation. There's no alternative to that. I again urge our leaders in Washington provide the emergency funding the MTA so desperately needs to keep New York moving. We can't live in this city without adequate public transportation. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I hope our message is heard in Washington and we get the funding we need. Thank you.
The next speaker is Chris Gray.
Good afternoon, everyone, or I should say good morning. I'm Christopher D. Gray, member of the New York City Transit Riders Council and accessibility to the subways and buses and Long Island Railroad ADA Task Force. My concern is that we do not want to see cuts at all for any MTA bus, subway, Long Island Railroad, Metro North, including accessibility. As the capital is coming, as the capital money, we definitely need it for accessibility elevators. We definitely need for the ramps, update our technology for making sure people with disabilities or seniors are getting the necessary help to get on buses, subways, including accessorize. So all I'm asking is from the MTA is we have to keep advocating, but I'm also encouraging Washington to please get yourself together and stop fighting each other, and let's work together and let's get the funding in. As a lot of us say, this has nothing to do with politics time. This has to do with safety, health, safety, and everything else together. So I hope that MTA, as they're doing their best, but I hope our elected officials can hear this clearly. Stop the fighting, stop being disrespectful, and let's work together and get the funding in. Doesn't matter which party you're in, let's get it done now. Thank you.
The next speaker is Lisa Daglian.
Greetings. I'm Lisa Daglian, Executive Director of the Permanent Citizens Advisory Committee to the MTA, PCAC. This board meeting is being convened to discuss the MTA's finances in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know the news is bad and will only get worse if desperately needed federal funds don't come through. Without the billions of dollars needed through the end of 2021, you will be forced to take difficult actions, including deep service cuts, reduced cleaning, substantial fare increases, harmful layoffs, and a significant reduction in the capital program. We're all in this fight together. Millions of New Yorkers rely on the city's subways and buses and the Long Island Railroad and Metro North to get to work, jobs that support our region's recovery and are helping rebuild our economy. As we move into our next normal, it is critical that safe and sufficient services is available to anyone who needs it. To us, that includes a plan to return to 24/7 subway service. The overnight closures to remove homeless and thoroughly clean cars and stations have been in place since May. With milestones and metrics rightly being the cornerstone of the state's reopening, we urge similar publicly discussed metrics for restoration of overnight service. If there's a plan for reopening gyms, there should be one for reopening the subway. And since the majority of overnight use has historically been between 4 and 5 a.m., we'd like to see a more immediate option for rolling back closures to restart service at 4. Riders must feel and be safe whenever they travel. Even with lower ridership, we're alarmed by attacks on workers and apparent upticks in subway crime and vandalism. The former coming as brazen assaults, and the latter resulting in train cars being taken out of service when that can least be afforded. While many cautions have been taken to address COVID, we'd like to know what plans are being developed to address these important safety concerns. We know that your efforts in these and other areas depend heavily on funding. We're committed to fighting this critical fight with you. Thank you.
The next speaker is Deborah Greif.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Greif. I'm the chairperson the Brooklyn Family Support Service Advisory Council. I'm extremely concerned because many times when cuts are done to the MTA, it does affect people with disabilities. And disabilities does not discriminate. It affects everyone from babies to seniors. I'm concerned because we have been going more forward with building more elevators, some ramps, and we need more ramps. But I'm concerned because when the last cut you had, it affected the disability community so badly, especially with the bus service. I actually will say I'm kind of glad that you will be starting to collect the fares by the end of August. And I say this because I'm tired of being harassed by certain bus drivers who do not understand that what a disability means. You don't have to show your disability. In fact, you don't even have to look like a senior. You just have to have, if you have proof, that's it. And the route they need to, I would like to see, besides the cuts, I would like to see the drivers and many of the staff who work in the train stations are given updated disability etiquette training. As I'm tired of myself and other fellow advocates being insulted and told we have to go to the back of the bus when some of us are under 5 feet tall, and there are times the parent is so disabled they cannot lift the child. This disability community will be advocating to make sure funding is kept and restored for the full MTA, and also to make sure that all new improvements for accessibilities are kept. Thank you.
The next speaker is Felicia Park Rogers.
Good day. My name is Felicia Park Rogers. I am the Director of Regional Infrastructure Projects for Tri-State Transportation Campaign, one of our region's most longstanding transportation policy and advocacy organizations. First, I would like to thank the MTA board and staff for their tremendous dedication to our region's transit systems during these truly unprecedented times. New York City's economy, the region's economy, and indeed our nation's economy all rely on the maintenance of a fully functioning MTA. We need it now to transport workers with no other means of transportation, and we will need it in the future if we are to have any hopes of a full and meaningful economic recovery. Along those lines, at Tri-State, we will continue to advocate to the full extent of our abilities for the MTA to receive more than $10 billion in emergency relief aid from the federal government. We realize the MTA's current budget crisis is through no fault of its own and is on a scale too massive to be solved with budget cuts. Just as the federal government would be tasked with helping a region recover from a natural disaster such as a hurricane or earthquake, so too is federal assistance required to recover from this public health disaster. And we will continue to push for that even as the talks in Congress have stalled. Meanwhile, even as we are all well aware of the overwhelming financial difficulties being faced by the MTA, we call on you to only cut service as a last resort. Even at a vastly reduced ridership, the MTA provides more than 2 million rides a day. These are frontline essential workers who need to get to work to feed their families. These are grandmothers traveling to their doctor's appointments. These are parents taking their children to daycare. These are our city's most stalwart and vulnerable residents whose economic and practical lives cannot function without a fully functioning MTA. Our research at Tri-State has shown that one of the most important ways to keep transit from being a vector of the novel coronavirus, in addition, of course, to mask wearing and air ventilation, is to keep crowding down. If service is reduced, buses and trains will become crowded and there will be increased risks of spread. The region's health and economy depend on maintaining frequent service for our buses and trains. Additionally, the long-term please include public input as you face service changes and cutbacks. It will be critical to maintaining the priorities and responsiveness that our region deserves. Thank you again.
The next speaker is Skylar Bissam-Rapp.
Hi, my name is Skylar Bissam-Rapp. I'm a senior associate at the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism. We're a planning and architecture firm in New York. We second everything that the other speakers have said. We're proponents of transit for its own sake, especially at this time with increased needs for health and safety. But furthermore, we want to call attention to the need for transit as a holistic part of city planning in general. This work is exemplified by the project that we undertook with Farhad Manjoo of the New York Times for his recent editorial, I've Seen a Future Without Cars. And what that project highlights is the relationship between transit, and density in order to create livable and sustainable cities. This is more than just a superficial issue. This is also an equity issue, as historically marginalized and vulnerable communities are those most affected by increased fare costs and decreased service, as the rising cost of housing makes people look further afield for affordable places to live. Ensuring that transit options connect people regionally is critical, not just that service levels are maintained, but that they're expanded in order to meet the increasing needs for transit in a larger interconnected region. In light of this, federal funding for the MTA is indispensable to the future of the New York City region, and federal funding for transit more broadly is critical to the future of American cities. Thank you.
The next speaker is Matt Camper.
Good morning, MTA board. My name is Matt Camper. I'm the regional director for the Long Island Railroad with Passengers United. So the MTA, I understand, is going through a horrible time, a financial crisis that we've never seen in our lifetimes. And I completely understand, what's going on with that and everything. But, the feds, including Mitch McConnell, President Donald Trump in Washington, will not help us out, will not make sure that we get the money that we need to stay afloat as an organization, and make sure that, most importantly, that riders get around where they need to go when they need to. And I think, and along with my colleagues from Passengers United, also think at the same time that it is time that we need to start looking out for ourselves and looking out for, what's best for us. And that is why today I am calling on the state legislature up in Albany, the state Senate, the state assembly, and the governor to come up with some kind of bill, because at the same time, New Jersey has a gas tax in place, and I think it's like 41 cents of it goes towards, different transportation projects in New Jersey, including New Jersey Transit. And I think it is something that will absolutely help us here in New York if we have a gas tax that is in place. So that way, let's say even that 41 cents, maybe 25 cents of it, of each gas time somebody pays for gas will go towards the MTA. And that will be a solution that I think will be absolutely, without a doubt, something that can help the MTA with its financial situation. So I really hope the MTA can work with the state legislature to come up with this and come up with a bill that will benefit us riders. So that's it. Thank you so much.
The next speaker is Jason Anthony.
Good morning, MTA board. I'm Jason Anthony, the Executive Vice President of Passengers United. We are aware that the MTA is in a financial crisis. We all have been experiencing it throughout the past few months. But it is time that the MTA thinks outside the box. Something like considering a gas tax, just like New Jersey, or like other jurisdictions use 1 penny, or in other words, 1 cent of their sales tax to cover transportation. It is time that Pat Foy and the other board members send a clear message to the state assembly and the state senate and to the governor that we cannot be dependent of the federal government. The federal government is not going to help us, to be honest. They won't, because they only think about themselves. So my recommendation is look for help and look for it from the state. And another thing, I think that we should keep the buses free for now, because I think it's premature to charging fares, despite that we are still in the middle of a pandemic. What if it gets worse? And people will have to take 3 buses and pay $5.50 to get from one place to another. So let's do what we have to do, but let's do it wisely. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
The next speaker is Charlton D'Souza.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Charlton D'Souza. I'm the president of Passengers United. And I have to say, first and foremost, that I agree with the gas tax that's being proposed by some of our members, Matt Camper. And I also feel that we should have advertising in the subways, on subway seats, subway buses, and that'll generate more money, and also sponsorship of subway stations by companies that will help generate more revenue. Now, let's go on to the overnight service changes. I'm very, very upset that the cabs are being canceled overnight. But first and foremost, I feel that why is it overnight that people have to pay a bus fare when the subways are closed? And what I don't understand is people now who have to take 3 buses coming from lower Manhattan are going to have to pay 3 fares if they live in Southeast Queens, or 4 fares. You guys need to rethink that. And I think the buses overnight should be free. Also, the Long Island Railroad should be free, because essential workers have been through enough. They weathered the storm. They protected our city. They should not have to be charged overnight. And that's my opinion. Also, with the crime that's been going on in the subways and the breaking of windows on the 7 train, I think it's a disgrace, whoever's doing this. And I think that the police need to be out in full force at every station. And also with the homeless, even though the subways are closed between 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., we don't see the homeless being taken out of the subways. You know, the cops are coming downstairs, they see the homeless, and they're letting them stay there overnight, and then they disappear, the police. So what's the purpose of keeping the subways closed then from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m.? So we really need to rethink how we're doing this cleaning thing and whether it's the best for the city. But I feel that we can still clean the subways and keep the, keep everything open, but we just need to have police on the trains, or just run shorter train cars overnight, so that the homeless can take over the trains. And I'm sorry, I understand that people are, in need, and there's a lot of people right now who are homeless. We get that, but the MTA has an $8 million contract with the Bowery Residents Committee. So we need to find out what is happening with this contract. We need to even find out if the state and the city's social systems are working. We need to understand this. But in terms of your MTA employees, there's going to be a candlelight ceremony on Wednesday, and we support all of them, including the ones who passed away. Our condolences go to all of them. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes the public comments.
Thank you very much. Tom, do you have board members to check?
Yes. I'd like to call the names of 2 board members who did not respond initially, and please indicate verbally if you are here. Lorraine Cortez Vasquez.
Here.
John Samuelson. John Samuelson.
I'm here.
Thank you. That's it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you for joining this special meeting of the MTA Board. It's unusual for us to meet in August, but times are grim and the urgency of our financial distress demands we meet. At this point, we have discussed repeatedly the extreme devastation that COVID-19 has wreaked on our agency, on our employees, and on our finances. This is by far the most difficult challenge the MTA has ever faced. I start today with 2 points. First, the survival of the MTA and the existence of millions of jobs in this region and across the country lies squarely in the hands of the federal government, the United States Senate to be specific. Continued federal indifference and inertia on a COVID-19 relief bill will exact an horrific toll on the MTA, our heroic workforce, and millions of hardworking New Yorkers who are our customers in the New York region, and people all over the state of New York working on MTA projects, rail cars, buses, ADA upgrades, signaling, and more. My second point is a word about the Great Depression. Americans measure national financial and social calamity against the Great Depression. Millions were thrown out of work and out of their homes. The Depression lasted a decade. You may be shocked to know that the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, exacerbated by federal inaction, has exacted a far greater toll on the MTA's predecessors' ridership and revenues than the Great Depression, which began with the October 1929 stock market crash. Start with the Long Island Railroad. Ridership was flat in 1930 after the October crash. It declined by about 7% in 1931, and at its worst was down a third from 1929 passenger levels. Long Island ridership today is down about 75% from pre-pandemic levels. On Metro-North's predecessor, the New York Central Railroad, estimated annual Grand Central Terminal ridership was about flat in 1930, and at its lowest point during the Great Depression declined a third from 1929, compared to the startling current 83% decline in ridership on Metro-North. On New York City buses and streetcars, ridership declined approximately 16% from 1929 levels. Today, buses are about 45% below pre-COVID-19 ridership. Subway ridership, which at its worst during the pandemic was down 95% this spring, and today is down approximately 75%. Subway ridership after the October 1929 stock market crash peaked in 1930 at slightly over 2 million riders and declined modestly, about 12% by 1933 in the following years. In sum, the MTA has never, even during the Great Depression of the 1930s, seen ridership declines as severe and as sustained as we are experiencing right now. And the MTA has never, even during the Great Depression, seen revenue losses of this magnitude. Last month, we unveiled our July financial plan, which painted an alarming picture of our financial outlook. We're losing about $200 million a week in revenues from losses in fares, tolls, subsidies, and pandemic-related expenses. This morning, our CFO, Bob Foran, will explain in greater detail the previously unthinkable options we're left with if we have to manage these insurmountable deficits on our own. We are acutely aware of the human toll that the mere discussion of these horrific actions will cause, and the extreme distress affecting and completing these actions will cause to our heroic workforce and to our customers, including ADA customers. But if the Senate doesn't act and we don't receive $12 billion in additional federal funding, we will have no choice. As you know, we're seeking another $12 billion of federal funding to replenish lost revenues through the remainder of 2020 and through 2021. Without this additional federal funding, we could be forced to take the draconian measures, the impact of which will be felt across the system, the region, for decades to come. We've already seen our credit rating downgraded by various credit rating agencies, which makes borrowing more expensive. Last week, we sold $451 million in notes to the Federal Reserve Bank after Wall Street firms bid higher rates because of their concern about our financial situation. The MTA is only the second entity to use the Fed's $500 billion municipal lend facility program for states and cities, following the state of Illinois. We do not want to take any of the actions we will outline today, and to be clear, no resolution is being presented to the board and no action is being taken today. But these actions that we will have to consider in the weeks and months ahead may be taken out of our hands if the U.S. Senate continues to fail to act. We are required by law to balance our budget and cannot declare bankruptcy. We also can't expect aid from the city and state because they, too, are facing equally hard times. That also requires federal funding. I can't be any clearer. The federal government must deliver for the MTA. It is literally our only option for survival. It is shameful and outrageous that U.S. Senate leadership continues to ignore our needs. The emergency relief authorized in the CARES Act back in March was completely exhausted July 24th, about a month ago. There's no ignoring the gaping hole in the budget that remains. I do want to acknowledge the work of the New York congressional delegation led by Senator Schumer, Chair Lowy, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, and the entire delegation with respect to passage of the CARES Act. The MTA is the lifeblood of New York. Without question, there is no economic recovery without a healthy MTA, and there is no national recovery without a healthy New York. That is why investment in the MTA is in the national interest. We must protect the future of our region by protecting and advancing mass transit. We will continue to advocate hard for this critical and urgently needed funding, and to work with all of our partners in the business, real estate, labor, not-for-profit communities, and elected officials, of course, to make it abundantly clear to Washington, D.C., just how much $12 billion of additional funding is needed. Today, we're also launching the hashtag Save Transit digital campaign to continue to spread the word and build support. This situation is particularly hard given how our workforce has performed above and beyond the call of duty during the last 6 months of the pandemic. These men and women showed up for work day after day. They couldn't telecommute, they couldn't work remotely, while most of New York was on pause. They truly were and continue to be the heroes who move heroes during this public health crisis. And it's not fair that we're in this position, especially given all the progress we've made together the last few years before COVID-19 hit. But this is our reality today. By law, we must balance our budget, and unlike Washington, we can't print money. I'll end where I began, that the future of the MTA and the future of the New York region rests squarely in the hands of the federal government, the U.S. Senate specifically. We need our federal partners to recognize the dire situation we're in, worse for MTA ridership and revenue, startlingly, than the Great Depression, and how important the MTA and New York is to the nation's economic recovery. If they fail to do so, horrendous choices lie ahead. I'll now turn it over to Pat Warren for a brief update on the MTA's recent efforts related to COVID-19. Pat.
Thank you, Pat. As is always the case, the health and safety of our employees and customers is our top priority. I'm relieved to report that due to the series of safety measures that have been implemented throughout the pandemic, the MTA is completing 3 months with extremely low numbers of new positive COVID-19 cases in the low single digits, 0, 1, or 2 per day, as well as no new fatalities. Further, our aggressive application of safety protocols is also delivering transportation to now over 2.5 million customers daily. That is among the safest in the world. MTA efforts also contributed to New York's 3-week run with less than a 1% new positive COVID-19 case rate. Our safety measures included providing over 6.6 million masks to employees and customers, 8.4 million pairs of gloves, 57,000 gallons of hand sanitizer, 5.6 million sanitizing wipes, and 158,000 gallons of cleaning solution. We continue our aggressive and daily cleaning and disinfecting of stations, trains, buses, paratransit vehicles, and employee workspaces. We have limited potential exposure to the virus through the addition of safety barriers in buses, elimination of the handling of cash, health screenings including temperature checks, the introduction of improved air filters in facilities and rolling stock, and a rich media campaign reminding employees and customers of requirements to wear facial coverings, social distancing, and the need for good hygiene. MTA further has worked with leading scientific, technological, and federal safety agencies, including the EPA, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia Universities, to pioneer new disinfecting protocols and safety systems, such as the development of antimicrobial and ultraviolet light disinfectants. MTA's implementation of these and many other safety measures have led and helped guide the transportation industry both nationally and internationally. But as you're acutely aware, the pandemic is not over. Therefore, MTA continues to look for and implement new advancements in safety which further reduce the risk of contracting the virus and facilitate our transportation operations. Of note, in close collaboration with our labor unions, we recently announced that we will be able to resume front door boarding on our buses next week due to the development and installation of improved, innovative barriers. These barriers further facilitate the resumption of fare collection by both protecting the bus driver and the patrons. This effort is another standard-setting achievement within the passenger transportation industry. Also, we have contracted with healthcare providers to gain priority access to both standard and rapid COVID-19 diagnostic testing, a service which allows MTA to rapidly determine the effects of our employees' exposure to the virus and implement quarantine protocols which support our employees' health as well as sustain operations. Together with the New York State and New York City, the MTA participates in an aggressive contact tracing process which assists in rapidly identifying the potential effects of COVID-19 clusters and their subsequent containment at work and within our communities. We have built applications which customers can use to see capacity limitations of buses and train cars, which allows these customers to make informed decisions regarding the avoidance of potential crowding situations. We continue to improve our public information efforts regarding the use of masks. Our most recent effort and well-received program is our Mask Force. Here, volunteers spread out through the transportation system and offer free masks to those who need one, and we would be pleased and grateful to have anyone on this call join us with this program. A further note, MTA continues its collaboration with the health and science communities to avoid the challenges presented by COVID-19 and develop new solutions to combat it. Examples of collaboration include working with Mount Sinai and New York University on identifying regimes that promote customers' proper mask usage, the implementation of rapid diagnostic testing, the efficacy of safety protocols, and identification of at-risk populations. In short, MTA is not resting in its efforts to find and implement solutions that will further protect our employees and customers from COVID-19 and provide the safe transportation service New Yorkers need and deserve. Chairman, this concludes my report.
Thank you, Pat. Any questions or comments from board members for Pat Warren? All right, thank you. Next, Bob Froyen, our Chief Financial Officer, will provide an update on the MTA's finances, which I referred to a couple of minutes ago. As you've heard this morning and in prior board meetings, we're facing the worst crisis in MTA history, and we will be forced to take draconian actions without immediate and substantial federal aid. In the absence of an extraordinary amount of funding from the federal government, $12 billion to take us through the remainder of 2020 and 2021, we will have no choice but to take the actions outlined today or terrible actions comparable to them. To be clear, there'll be no board resolution or vote today. Lastly, the MTA does not have, and in no reasonable scenario will this agency have other means to close a deficit of this size. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the July plan, we stated that if additional federal assistance was not forthcoming, hard, unpleasant decisions would have to be made. The chairman said everything would be on the table. Wage freezes, fare and toll increases, delay or reduction in the capital program, reductions in force, and service cuts. The purpose of today's briefing is first to reiterate the critical necessity of receiving the $12 billion of federal aid requested. But if it is not forthcoming, we must look at these hard choices, and that's what we'll do today. And we will put a dollar value on them in order to provide an order of magnitude for your consideration and for the public discussion. Next slide. This is the results of the July plan. Absent the $3.9 billion that we were requesting at that time for this year, you can see the deficits will be $3.2 billion, and it will require immediate action. Next slide. We need to address two issues: how to solve the immediate problem caused by the revenue loss, and also how to solve the long-term structural imbalance in a post-pandemic world. Without $12 billion in federal aid, the first line of solution, presented here on the next page, totals roughly about $1.2 billion a year for the next 2 years. But as you'll see, it will not solve our financial problem for the remainder of 2020, let alone for 2021. We just cannot reduce our expenses quickly and significantly enough to offset the 40% reduction in revenues we have experienced and are expected to continue to experience. Next slide. There are certain deficit reduction options which we should be prepared to implement immediately. In July, we identified spending reductions in 3 areas: overtime, consulting contracts, and other non-personnel expense reductions. At that time, we said we had identified $340 million worth of cuts in 21, 270 in 22, 23, it was 255, and in 2024, 275. We said this was the beginning. We were going to continue to look for cuts, and we have found additional savings that we plan on implementing. That is not the end. We will continue to review these categories because we believe there's still savings that we can identify and implement. But now we're looking at $540 million of savings in 21, 480 in 22, 445 in 23, and 455 in 2024. We also think we ought to look initially to reduce or delay certain capital funds and the expenditures related. The legislature gave us the ability to use the lockbox revenues, that is the Internet Marketplace Sales Tax and the Mansion Tax, for 2 years. That money had previously been specified to only support capital and not for operations. But we have this latitude now, and we need to be prepared to put it on the table and utilize it. Should we receive the federal aid, this money could go back to the capital program. But absent that, we need to use this money. We also have pay-as-you-go capital that we have built into the budget each of the years. We propose eliminating that and using that for deficit reduction. We have set aside monies in a trust fund, the OPEB trust fund. OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. That's primarily health care for our retirees. We pay the health care retirees' current cost each year, but this is money that was set aside to be invested at a higher return to provide for future health care costs. Well, we don't need to look at the future there. We need to bring this money forward. And so we now have that money available, which we can use for current employee retiree health care costs. Again, if federal funds are available, we may not have to do this, but we need to be prepared to implement these 2 measures. The grand total is almost $1.2 billion for the next 2 years, 20 and 21, and then 600, 559, and 564 in the out years. They are significant contributions to addressing our deficits, but it's not enough to close the gap. What are additional options for deficit reductions? Well, we said potential fare and toll increases. What we've identified here is units of measure to help consider the relative value in reaching a solution in the absence of federal funding. By fare and toll increases, for every 1% we raise the fare above the 4% that we were planning to put in place in 21, we could generate $50 to $60 million a year. For the toll increase that we had planned on putting in place in 2021, every dollar above the 4% increase that we were going to put in place would generate a significantly greater amount of money. 270 in 21, 343, almost 350 in the out years. The 2023 proposed fare increase, each 1% above the 4% would generate about $50 or $60 million beginning in 2023, and each dollar increase in toll above the 4% that we had planned would be 270 in 23 and 343 in 2024. Again, no one wants to raise the fare above what we planned. There's questions of even putting the planned fare and toll increase, but right now that is built into our financial plan. But I caution again, it's subject to public hearings and it's subject to board approval in 21 and 23. What else? Well, service reductions. We looked at a number of scenarios in terms of reducing service. And for this purpose, what we've identified on the subway, buses, and Staten Island Railroad is a potential service reduction which without $12 billion in federal aid could be forced to reduce service by up to 40%. Now, this could be implemented in myriad ways. The example that we have here suggests that this would generate almost $880 million annually net of the lost revenues. What are the implications? Well, subway headways could increase up to 8 minutes. Off-peak headways on Staten Island Railroad could increase by 30 minutes. Bus headways could increase by up to 15 minutes. Estimated workforce impact would be a permanent reduction of over 7,200 positions. In addition, the following actions may be needed to address the shortfall. There could be changes to the accessoride program, such as increasing trips to feeder service and eliminating on-demand service, which could save us $65 million a year. On the commuter railroads, without $12 billion in federal aid, Long Island Railroad and Metro North could be forced to reduce service up to 50%. Again, this could be accomplished in myriad ways, but the example here would have these impacts. Reduced service frequency of 60 minutes on heavier ridership lines, branch lines, and 120 minutes on lower ridership branches and lines, eliminating service on one or more Long Island branches. This would save us about $160 million annually, net of expected revenue losses. But the estimated impact on our workforce would be permanent reductions of nearly 850 positions. In addition, the following actions may be needed to address the shortfall. Delay the start of service into East Side Access. If we delay it a couple of years, it could save us $250 million in operating cost. Closing ticket windows could result in the permanent reduction of up to 60 positions and estimated savings of $8 million annually. Elimination of west of Hudson service in New York could save $25 million annually in operating cost and avoid nearly $1.2 billion of capital expenses in the future. On bridges and tunnels, without $12 billion in federal aid, Bridges and Tunnels could be forced to change its toll structure and reduce staff, impacting regional mobility. Eliminating resident discounts would save over $65 million annually. Implementing peak period pricing could generate over $100 million annually. The estimated workforce impact is a permanent reduction of nearly 300 positions for a savings of $40 million, resulting in increased frequency of lane closures and potential facility closures to ensure safety. Delays in response time to non-critical incidents and less frequent customer-facing maintenance, such as painting or landscaping. Then less timely information for customer messaging, leading to travel delays. In terms of construction and development, there's potential project impacts. Without $12 billion in federal aid, MTA construction and development could be forced to pause the 2024 capital programs and affect certain very important projects. Potential projects that could be paused include 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2, Penn Station access, 4 Bronx stations, additional ADA station upgrades, purchasing of the electric bus fleet, purchasing of new subway rolling stock, CBTC signal modernization projects, including the Lexington line, and the Long Island Railroad Central Branch electrifications. Now, there's other things that we could do, but really they're just cash flow management for the most part. But we will look at those because cash flow is going to be critical as we move forward. The potential expense deferral or wage freeze options are listed here. The first expense deferral is the payroll tax deferral. Underneath the CARES Act, we have the ability as an employer not to remit the payroll taxes on a payroll by payroll period, but to hold on to those and then to pay half of the amount at the end of next year and half of the amount at the end of 2022. Basically, it's an interest-free loan that is available to us. We have been holding that money back, and that is going to be additional cash flow for us. Then there's the possibility of deferring or delaying our pension plan contributions, both to NICERS, and also our contribution to the MTA-sponsored pension programs. Now, that does come with a cost, because we can save the contribution, but that contribution will have to be repaid, and it will be repaid at the interest that we would have earned on that account had it been fully invested. You can see there the cost. So again, those are merely cash flow management items. With regard to the wage freeze, and this is a wage freeze on represented and non-represented employees, we could do it on a permanent basis. If that were the case, you can see the savings that build up from $58 million this year to $309 in 22 to $322 in 2024. If it were merely a postponement, so a wage freeze through 2022 and then a retroactive payment due the next year, you can see the results. So again, a cash flow benefit up front, but the retro would have to be paid in 2023, which would increase our deficits. MTA faces a $12 billion cash shortfall through 2021, which consists not only of the operating budget impacts reflected previously in the July plan, but also the loss of $1 billion just in 2021 that was to be dedicated to the capital program due to federal inaction on the central business tolling program. That is money that our capital program was counting on. That is money that will definitely cause us to delay capital projects. We need that money. We need that approval. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation.
I'm not going to say thank you, Bob, but before I open discussion and questions from board members, I want to emphasize 3 or 4 points. One, as we said before, we are not taking action today on any of these alternatives. There is no resolution before the board. Second, we continue to work on cutting costs. As Bob mentioned, in 2021, thanks to the work of my agency president colleagues, we have identified non-service and non-personnel expense reductions in 2021 of approximately $540 million. That's on top of $800 million of cost cuts already included in the financial plan for 2021. That work continues. Third, the actions we are outlining and discussing today are of the scope and magnitude necessary given the size of the pandemic-caused deficits. But the actual alternatives that are discussed before the board and the public and enacted may be different in scope, nature, and timing. But we are $12 billion short, and that reality is not going away. Fourth, we will come back to the board and the public with more specific service reduction proposals. Same with respect to toll and fare increases, wage freezes, pause on the capital plan, and every one of the items that Bob just discussed. Finally, fifth, the solution to this nightmare resides in Washington. And the financial issues we face dwarf what the MTA's predecessors faced in the Great Depression. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and comments from my board colleagues.
Pat?
Larry.
Hi, thank you. Obviously, some of the information that Bob has spoken about has been shared with the board previously, and obviously things are not getting better from a financial situation. I mean, the reality here is, in addition to the federal government creating a nightmare for the MTA, they're basically, if they don't take an action to bail us out, they're going to bankrupt the agency. Because the reality is, forgetting whether or not any of us want to accept or agree with any of the reductions or cuts that Bob has laid out, and I don't think any board member wants to see layoffs, okay? Even as a last result, we don't want to see that. But the reality is, when you add everything up, you don't even get halfway there. I tried to quickly you pull out my calculator as Bob was going through everything, and I didn't even get to $5 billion. $5 billion with drastic reductions in service that are really unacceptable. Probably about 10,000 layoffs, if not more. These options and choices are unacceptable, and they're not sustainable. And they don't even get you where you need to be, even if you were to do every single one of them. And if the federal government doesn't act and doesn't act soon, they're in essence shutting down New York State's mass transit system. They're bankrupting the largest mass transit system in the world. And I hope that every CEO in New York City and New York State is listening and watching to this thing, that every major New York City developer is listening and watching this meeting, because it's not just going to be the riders who rely and depend on this system. It's going to be every business and every employee that lives and works here in the downstate area that is going to be drastically impacted. Our economic quality of life and way of life is going to be drastically impacted. Our ability to provide essential services is going to be drastically impacted. The only entity that can address this problem, the only entity that can solve this problem, at least on a short-term basis, 20, 21, maybe 22, is the federal government. And we have to keep the pressure on both the Senate and the House for them to come up with a solution that will include New York State and the MTA mass transit system, because as I said, whether or not you agree that some of these measures should be done as part of a transformation of the MTA on a long-term basis or on some level, we have a short-term crisis. We have to focus on the short-term crisis as well as not lose focus on the long-term transformations that are needed to keep the system healthy. But the bottom line is, you could do all these drastic, horrendous actions, and you don't even get halfway there. So, and again, the reason why I said I hope that the CEOs and developers, because they need to get on the phone and call their friends in Washington and tell them to get off their butts and to meet and to take action to help the people of New York State and the ridership of the MTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
Mr. Chairman?
I'd like to, Pat.
Commissioner Mack, yes.
I agree with Larry, and I also agree with what some of the comments were regarding an emergency gas tax for our region. I think that we got to do something just in case Washington doesn't hear our call. Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Zuckerman.
Thank you, sir. Although I think, Frank, did you raise your hand beforehand? I don't want to jump over you.
I did, but go ahead, Rand.
Sorry, Commissioner Borelli.
Neil, go ahead.
Commissioner, you're
Frank,
next.
I'll go after you.
Okay. I agree with Commissioner Fleischer's comments about we need help from the federal government. I think that's obvious to everybody here and in New York that we need help, and without that help, we're not going to be able to move forward and protect our employees and more important, and as important, our customers. Pat used the word horrific. It's really not strong enough. I mean, this is, catastrophic. I mean, for Rockland County, page 7 at the bottom, eliminating west of Hudson service in New York. This is an absolute elimination of MTA services for Rockland County and counties north of here. I don't understand why Rockland County would even be part of the MTA if there was no longer services provided to the residents of this county. Currently there's a $40 million value gap between the monies we pay in and the services we get back. I understand the need for cuts. I understand the need for reductions. We will have to pitch in on this, and quite frankly, I think we need to get more creative and find ways to do that. I just simply want to state that Rockland County is not going to accept what's being proposed as part of the fix or the solution at the end. And I'm hopeful that we can work together to make sure that never happens and that we continue to provide services to those here in Rockland County, because as much as we're sitting here saying we're not getting help from the federal government, you're actually right here. We're doing the same thing to a part of our region, which is Rockland County. We're not getting the money from the federal government. They're the bad guy, which they clearly are here. But let's not be the bad guy for the citizens of Rockland County, who I represent. And I've already spoken with the county executive on this issue, and he is outraged is a mild statement. So I appreciate how we can work together to make this not happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Zuckerman.
Thank you, sir. So my favorite part of Governor Cuomo's father's speech in 1984 at the Democratic Convention was when he said, "So here we are. So here we are." It was this wonderful pause he created between setting the problem statement and what we're going to do about it. So here we are. I mean, in many ways, it doesn't matter how we got here. David Jones has been talking about our debt levels in every board meeting since I met him several years ago. And we still went that direction. But here we are. And I know the solution that you, Pat, and the governor's office, I'm sure, and Rob Mohica and others have been pounding the table from the federal government is the most viable, most appropriate path given the challenges that the state and the city face. I understand that, and I do appreciate all you're doing. And what Bob clearly shows us that when you reduce New York City Transit by 40%, ladies and gentlemen, 40% reduction, you only generate $880 million in savings. That just shows you what an incredible fixed cost we have here. Think about that. New York City Transit takes up most of our cost ex debt, and we can only save $880 million by cutting it by almost half. That just tells you the difficult situation we're in. But here's my concern. My concern is that the federal government is a path. It is clearly the most viable path. It is not the only path, and we cannot rely upon it. Now, I'm on this board as a fiduciary of the MTA. I think of my role not as any constituency. I'm here as a fiduciary to protect the institution. At least that's what I think I'm supposed to be doing here. And I need us to think about contingency-wise, whether we talk about it publicly or privately, how we are thinking about the other levers we have available to us. I am sure I'm not the only person in this group who thinks about 1975 and thinks about Abe Beame fritting about, unsure what to do when bankruptcy was imminent. That the night when the debt was coming due, Beame went in front of the Whitetail dinner, the Alfred E. Smith dinner, and said, "I just don't know why Washington won't give us money. They were much nicer to us back in Al Smith's day." So the federal government didn't give us any money initially. And you all know what the Daily News put on the cover of that newspaper that week when Ford spoke. So I urge us, in parallel to the effort you're taking very thoughtfully, Pat, on the federal government, to think about what Governor Cuomo, the first Governor Cuomo's predecessor did, Governor Kerry, and demand that we figure out, to Larry's wonderful point, and I agree with you, Larry, I told all my CEO clients, I had 2 CEO client meetings this morning, I've already told both of them, I got this important call to make sure your employees can come to work. So I think the businesses, I think whether it's Frank's county exec or mine, the municipal governments, the real estate owners who have benefited for decades, Mr. Mack knows this quite well, who have benefited for decades by our growth, the unions, both directly through their wages and through their pensions, the bondholders, the banks, We have many people, many constituencies that came together in 1975 to save the city. Where is our Felix Royden? Where is our Dick Ravitch? Where is our Al Shanker right now that we need? Because the federal government, maybe they'll come through, but maybe they won't, and we've got to have an answer. So that's my plea, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I call on Commissioner Glucksman and please others, Neil, you raised an interesting point talking about the city's near-death experience with bankruptcy in 1975. Just to size it, we talked about the Depression at the beginning. I'll note that the New York City deficit in 1975 was $5 billion. We're talking about 12. Now, granted, it's 45 years later, but it gives you some sense of the dilemma we face. Commissioner Glucksman.
I don't know how I can beat my predecessors in there who spoke so eloquently about this, so I'm going to be very brief. There being no Orange County rep right now, I want to speak up for our customers who also ride the Port Jervis line in addition to the Pascack Valley line. I'm sure when the news of this goes up to the Orange County executive, he's not going to be too happy to hear that his service is being threatened, and I hope it is not. Thank you.
Yeah, so Commissioner Law and Commissioner Lynn.
Okay. Thanks, Pat.
I will get everybody. Kevin.
Yeah, my hand is raised as well, Pat.
After Bob, Lynn, Andrew. Kevin, back to you.
Thanks, Pat. To say that Bob's report was sobering is an understatement. We are about to see the worst train wreck in the system's history that no level of positive train control will help us avoid. But rather than hearing about the potential cuts to the Long Island Railroad are terrifying. But rather than us pitting each region against suburban systems versus the subway systems, we as a board need to stand united. The ball is in the federal government's court. That's where our focus should be. That's where our pressure should be. Let's not pit each region against each region. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Commissioner Lynn and Commissioner Alpert.
Thanks, Pat. Let me start by acknowledging the extraordinary work on the TA health and safety that Pat Warren talked about and his team of supervisors and line workers. The daily TA virus illness rates have gone from just extraordinarily off the charts in March and April to lower in May, and as Pat talked about, to incredibly low rates in June, July, and August, about as good as you can get during a pandemic. So I think this is something that is really a beacon of hope for both the workers and the public, and I think needs to be acknowledged of the extraordinary work that was done. Second, the budget. At the MTA, we've gone from, as you described, Pat, a 4-alarm fire to a tsunami to now what's being described as a unmitigated disaster. And I think what is really unique about this situation that separates it from the 75 crisis, separates it from anything we've looked at before, is that there are 3 public sector budget crises that are faced all at once. New York State faced substantial budget pressure before the virus. And now we hear that there are about $14 billion of revenue losses to the state. The city has said that they've got $9 billion of a hole that they need to fill in the next 2 years. And here at the MTA, over the next 16 months, and I point that out, that this fiscal year, 20, is 2/3 done. And so over the 4 months of 20, and then the next year, we have a $10 billion budget deficit that needs to be filled. So all 3 major jurisdictions are in incredibly tough times. And I fear that we've really delayed coming to grips in all 3 areas. And I'm concerned that these are extraordinary complex problems that raise extraordinarily important fairness issues as to how we're going to fix them, and we haven't really even begun the conversation. Now, I've always found that big financial challenges can be divided into problems of cash and rate. Rate needs continue over years to come and must be addressed by long-term budget reductions. cash problems need to be fixed now. And once fixed, they're generally not recurrent. And fortunately, the MTA future rate we don't know about and might not be so substantial in the going out. It was interesting what Jerry Seinfeld wrote on Monday in the New York Times op-ed. He said the city sure as hell will be back. And I believe that it will be back. But we sure as hell have a cash problem right now. And how do we deal with that cash problem? Now, there's no question federal assistance has to be the biggest piece. Clearly, the federal government hasn't fulfilled its responsibility to public transit and state and local governments, and any solution will require substantial federal aid. But we must not let the federal government shirk its responsibility. But until they act, and whatever level they act, we need to find a path that responsibly keeps the New York metro area transit running. And this is going to require discussion. I believe it requires discussion now of a balanced approach. We're going to need temporary revenue surcharges. Clearly taxes, whether it be the gas tax or whatever, clearly taxes have to be part of it. Other revenue sources need to be looked at. All of them need to be on the table. Borrowing, while the borrowing creates short-term problems into long-term problems because you got to repay the interest over time. But maybe some small piece of borrowing ought to be part of an overall approach. Perhaps probably some service demand adjustments could be necessary based on simply changes of need based on the virus. And labor. There is no question labor has been heroic, and the impact of the virus on the labor force has been horrible to deal with. But labor needs to step up to the table and deal with various changes. So I think that there needs to be a balanced approach at the MTA that is talked about now. Everybody needs to share the burden. And we've got to all do our part to make sure that New York City does come back stronger than ever. But it's only going to come back through a joint program where all of these areas are addressed and everybody steps up to the table and chips in to solve the problem. Thank you.
Commissioner Albert, Commissioner Khaleesi.
Yes, I absolutely agree with much of what my fellow commissioners have said up to this point. I do think a gas tax merits a serious discovery and follow through. It won't solve this kind of problem, but it might help the operating system going forward. And as we all have said, gas prices vary by day of week and by what gas station you go to. So it might not even be felt. It would actually be good for drivers because it would take a few cars off the road because the mass transit system could survive. And let's face it, the New York way of life is at stake right here. The ability to go out and get on a bus or train and get where you need to go. This should not be lost on Wall Street, on real estate, and the other thousands of employers that have thousands and thousands of employees who rely on this miracle of a transit system, which other cities envy and could not even hope to build. But now, some of these options, I think, merit a second look because I'm mindful of the June 27th, 2010 service cuts, which were the worst in MTA history and which cut ridership. And I'm wondering, this question is aimed for Bob Ferran, if some of those 40% cuts and 50% on commuter trains, if ridership loss has been factored into the revenue gain that you get by doing those things. Because who would buy a men's suit, if the price was raised considerably, but you only got half the suit? I don't think people would buy it. And I'm sure we would lose a lot of our ridership, thus even making the numbers worse than they are today, which is why I believe service cuts have to be the very last thing that we look at, because that's what makes the city function, the region function. People leave their cars at home, the economy flourish, and obviously Washington has to step up. And I've said it many times, New York is the economic engine of the Northeast, which is the economic engine of the country. But this is not just a Northeastern problem. There are other cities whose transit systems are suffering, and they're in red states like MARTA in Atlanta, DART in Dallas, and the Houston, and the RTA in Cleveland. This is not a red or a blue issue, it's a people issue. And we all have to get together. And if the Senate can't see this, we really have to change that sentence because this affects everybody's home state.
Andrew, thank you. Commissioner Calisi.
Thank you, Pat. It's been taking years and years for the MTA to pay attention to disability. We finally have gotten plans in place. We've been able to move this forward. Very exciting things were happening. And now we're hearing delays and cuts, and the community has suffered before and they're going to suffer even worse now. I'm quite concerned about it. I'm quite concerned about people with disabilities riding our systems throughout the region, and this is disheartening in many ways and very, very sad. And I know advocates are not happy right now, as well as I. And this is just insane, and the federal government needs to step up. And I don't think they are, Pat. I'm really concerned about it. And we really need a balanced approach here. And what that looks like is something that us, the board members, have a responsibility to do. We're committed to this. I've heard it with Zuckerman, Commissioner Zuckerman and Lynn talk about this. We want a balanced approach. How's this going to happen if federal government doesn't stick up? And how do we get this information beforehand so we can help you? And this is sad, and the government needs to federal government needs to step up. But I'm not confident in that, Pat. But we need to drive accessibility and drive it well the way it was before COVID. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anybody else?
Yeah, Pat, it's John Samuelson.
Commissioner.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's pretty clear, I think, to everybody that reducing capacity to this degree is going to it's going to run the risk of actually destroying New York City and certainly destroying the MTA system. The whole argument playing itself out on social media, which Bob Lynn touched on, about whether New York City is dead. This is going to ensure that New York City is dead, and Jerry Seinfeld himself is not going to be able to refute it. It's an absolute betrayal of riders, frontline workers, everybody involved with the MTA system. Now, I would say that the MTA should not even contemplate, as has been mentioned a couple of times here, thinking that organized labor, particularly the TW, is going to participate in any kind of concessionary element here in order to fund the deficits that you're talking about. We've paid with blood. The TW alone has just under 100 fatalities. To come and ask us to step up by opening up our contracts or by bargaining in some concessionary fashion is just utterly unthinkable. And the notion that you would come, which some members of the board think they may think is appropriate, that you would come to ask the workers that just put their necks on the line by being on the front line of this fight against COVID-19 is ridiculous. That we would fund an epic failure that's really come to light during COVID-19, obviously. But this is kind of also years in the making, and we've had nothing to do with this, and we're not going to participate in a bailout off of our backs and off the livelihoods of our families. I understand that the federal government needs to step up, but it's not our problem, and we're not going to step up, and we're not going to open up our contracts. I just want to make that clear. And by the way, I want to just say for the record that before you lay a glove on any member of the TW, any member of the Transport Workers Union, or any frontline worker for that matter, you got a lot of high-priced consultants floating around there. You got a lot of profiteering contractors walking around, and get rid of them. And I want to say, you brought in these two Canadian guys. I still have no idea what they do. It's an appropriate question, and it goes along with the other high-paid bosses that you're hiring. All of this stuff needs to be looked at, just as a matter of principle, before you lay a glove on any kind of frontline worker. And I think we're in the same boat as Rockland County. We have the same position as them. We're just not accepting this. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Pat, can I? Vinny Tessitore.
Vinny, please.
Yeah, so real brief. I mean, John hits it on the head over and over again, and the bottom line is this: clearly, if any essential workers are put at risk after what they've gone through, we know that we need a bailout, and labor is working as hard as anybody that's on this call at trying to advocate for the funding that's needed. But again, the workforce is really, really on edge at this point, obviously, and by the end of today, what they're going to read about and hear about is going to make things worse. And if any essential workers who have put themselves at risk and continue to do so each and every day are at risk, there will be labor unrest at this agency that we may really struggle to recover from. So, the city, you just heard from John, the Long Island is in the same boat. We have to come up with any other way, including a lot of the things that we added that we may not have needed to add before we consider anything. And it always comes back to the transformation end of it. I'm not looking to point fingers at anybody, but this MTA is being transformed whether we like it or not by COVID-19. So it's working its way through as we see, and we have to prioritize the frontline workers who are still out there at risk.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, Pat.
Commissioner Brown.
First of all, obviously, I want to associate myself with what my brothers Tessitore and Samuelson have just said. And I do have a couple other angles that I want you to consider as well. First of all, for our workforce at Metro North, they've seen already what a slippery slope we're on to go from essential worker to disposable worker. And as you cut the service, there's several diseconomies that associate with cutting the service. And one of them is obviously less service will be more crowded trains. And one of the things we've depended on financially over the years has been crowded trains. Crowded trains are efficient in terms of fare box recovery ratio, and this was an agency that was very dependent on fare box recovery ratio. Now, the catch is, of course, the crowded trains discourage people to come on the train because now it's in the post-COVID era. The crowded trains have a different sort of balance than they used to have. Now, that's part of it. Now, when it comes to the workforce, there are people in the workforce that when you cut them will not come back. You will lose that portion of the workforce. Not saying it's everybody. You're going to furlough people. People are going to have rights to return. These are good jobs. But you're going to lose substantial, talented people. And I suppose will be talented managers you will lose as well because of this. And then also there's a factor that, as Brother Samuelson and Tessitore spoke to in a moment ago, there will be a high level of bitterness among the remaining workers as a function of having gone so quickly from being essential worker heroes to disposable workers on a street. So that bitterness will affect your productivity and will affect their inclination to push us as union leaders to make agreements with you. Now, John Samuelson, you're sitting on an agreement. They have an agreement making you live to the terms of that agreement. A lot of our agreements are open. And that creates a substantial amount of anxiety and pressure on the union leaders and union members as well to protect their interests and their future on the railroad. Thank you very much for your presentation, and we look forward to working with you in the future. However, the way we're going now, it's down a road of confrontation, and it's not a road that we like to take. It's not a road where we expect a good exit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Pat?
Commissioner Lacewell.
Thank you, sir. The federal government is directly responsible for the situation that we are in, and not just because the Congress is not providing the funding. The federal government did not manage this public health pandemic. That is why we had to shut down. That is why our economy has been so adversely affected. And it's not just they didn't fund us. they have an obligation to step up because they created this situation, the federal government. And we have three crises in this state: the public health crisis, the economic and jobs crisis, and the racial justice crisis. These are all connected to each other. We all know Black and brown communities were more adversely affected by COVID. We know that they are more adversely affected by the economic damage. And we know that these things are connected also to the cry for justice with respect to race relations in this country. And it is an abomination that the federal government does not step forward. And if the federal government wants to repair the economy and get people back to work, as they claim they want to do, New York is a key engine of that economy. And there's no question that the MTA, including the subway transit bus system, is vital to that. So my comment would be, let's put the energy where it needs to be, and everybody should be stepping up to exert pressure on Washington, whether it's the business community, the financial community, the unions, the local electeds, everybody else who's been mentioned, because we don't have any magic potion or bullets for this. It is the federal government who created this problem, and they're the ones who need to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Anybody else? So I want to make a closing comment here, and I want to speak to the balanced approach, which it's hard to be against the balanced approach, but I think we have to be quite careful. One difference between this fiscal crisis and New York City in 1975 is worth noting. In 1975, the city was broke, the state was solvent, the federal government was solvent, and the business community, for the most part, around the region, around the nation, was healthy. That is not the case now. The city of New York has substantial fiscal issues, the state of New York has significant fiscal issues, and so do the other 49 states. And obviously, despite the fact that the stock market is at record highs, 20% of our neighbors are unemployed, the actual rate, taking into account minority communities, may be even higher. But the point is, while we ought to be agnostic as to where the revenue comes from, the reality is today the only solvent agency that can come, instrumentality that can come to the rescue, is the federal government. And to think that the state or the city is going to be able to make meaningful contributions, and again, we're going to be agnostic as to the source of dollars, but to think that any level of government other than the federal government is going to be able to solve this situation, a $12 billion deficit over the next 16 months, I think is a pursuit of a well-intentioned cause that must fail because of the size of the deficit. At the end of the day, it is only the federal government can solve this issue. And Commissioner Lacewell's points are exactly right and well taken across the board. This is a national and international crisis. The federal government exacerbated it, and only the federal government can come to the rescue of the MTA, and I think it's important we recognize that. Having said that, if there are other sources of funding, the MTA will be provided. The MTA will be agnostic and welcome every dollar. Any other comments on this issue before we break? All right, good. I thank everybody for your attention. Obviously, this is going to be the issue that we're going to be discussing in the weeks and months to come, and literally the survival of the MTA lies in the balance. Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor? Thank you.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you. Good to go? Thank you. Let me make a few opening remarks. I'm joined by my colleague, MTA CFO Bob Foran, to my right. A couple of things. One is, no one at the MTA in management, any of our 70,000 employees or anybody on the board wants to take any of the actions that we outlined today. No one wants to cut service. No one wants to eliminate the jobs of anybody in the organization, including our operating colleagues who were heroes during the pandemic, which I'll note is not over. And we are incredibly respectful of the distress that the discussion of these alternatives, which was necessary today, but we're incredibly respectful of the distress that the mere discussion of these alternatives causes in our employees and our customers, and the extreme distress that they would experience were we to have to enact any of these actions. Second is we had a long discussion about the need for federal funding, $12 billion. We cannot cut our way, the MTA can't cut its way out of this. Having said that, we've identified an additional $540 million of spending cuts, non-service related, non-personnel related, that we will affect in 2021. That's on top of an existing $800 million of expense cuts that are already built into the financial plan. So that's $1.3 billion, and that's added to the $2.5 billion that agency personnel in the CFO's office and at the agencies has taken out, $2.5 billion in prior years. Fourth, let's be clear, the MTA can't solve this pandemic-caused financial disaster without federal assistance. We're agnostic as to the source of revenues, but as I noted before, unlike the '75 fiscal crisis affecting the city of New York, where the city was broke, but the state and the federal government were solvent and the business community was solvent and able, and actually labor unions were able to come to the rescue there with pension funds. We don't have that situation. Only the federal government has the ability to solve this fiscal crisis. And then lastly, I think it's extraordinary that in the case of subways, buses, and streetcars, Long Island Railroad and Metro North, that the effect on ridership and revenues, even inflation adjusted, is extraordinarily more severe in the pandemic than it was in the greatest financial calamity in the 20th century, the 1929 stock market crash and the resulting depression. It's really extraordinary to me, and with that, we're happy to take your questions.
And the first question today will go to Andrew Siff of WNBC. Looks like he's rolling through New York City once again. Andrew. Just need you to unmute the controls, please.
Okay, you hear me now?
We do. You got to tell that Uber driver, Justin, to manage the tech for you.
Okay. So the question for Mr. Foy is, when would riders experience these service cuts and reductions? You've been talking about a storm and a tsunami for months. You've been talking about the $12 billion hole for months. But I think the riding public doesn't have any sense of when this would hit them. So when would you have to wait 8 more minutes for a train? When would you have to wait 15 more minutes for a bus, and when would the 7,200 job cuts take place?
So, Mr. Siff, my hope is that it doesn't occur. And my hope is that we get $12 billion in federal financing to take us through the rest of 2020 and 2021. That is our goal. It is an issue that we've been working closely with the business community, the real estate community, the not-for-profit community, and our labor partners in Washington. There was success on the CARES Act. Obviously, that money's been exhausted here at the MTA in July 24th. We're continuing to work with them. So my hope and aspiration is that we don't have to take the steps that were outlined today. If we don't get federal funding, we will have to take these actions to our board later this year in order to have effect in 2021.
Well, does later this year mean December? Is there any drop dead time where you have to start enacting this?
Andrew, we have a requirement to adopt the budget and the financial plan for 2021 and beyond. That's done at the November board meeting. So we can't wait till December, and it would be, I expect, either the November board meeting or prior.
And we move on to Randy Marshall of Newsday on the editorial board. Randy. Randy, just need you to unmute.
Okay. Hi, guys. Thanks. To go along with Andrew's question, specifically on the Long Island Railroad cuts, what are you thinking in terms of which cuts come first, which cuts come second? And when you talk about full branches being cuts, do you have any particular branches in mind?
So again, Randy, our hope is not to have to take these steps on the subways, on buses, Staten Island, Long Island Railroad, and Metro North. As I said, what we described today was the scope and the magnitude of the changes, the reductions in service that we might have to make, and no one wants to go down that road. But the timeline that I just described in terms of taking it to the board later this year and having to have a financial plan in place for 2021 considered and approved by the board at the November meeting applies in this case as well.
Do you have specific branches in mind when you talk about cutting a Long Island Railroad or more than one Long Island Railroad branch?
We don't. Again, we are scope and magnitude today. We're continuing to work on these and refine them with a view towards minimizing customer convenience. And clearly there's going to be customer convenience and disruption. And no one wants to go down that road, and it's going to be traumatic for customers and especially for our employees. We'll continue to refine that. We're not going to speak to specific branches, bus routes, or subway lines.
And next up is Clayton Gusa of the Daily News. Clayton, you are up.
Hey, can you hear me?
Clayton.
Hey, can you give us a little bit more detail on the $545 million, I think you said it was, in non-service operational related cuts that you're looking at for next year that you've already planned? What's the scope of those? What's included?
Sure, it's $540 million. Every part of the agency, including headquarters, it's primarily comprised of three categories. One is reductions in overtime, significant reductions in overtime. Second is reduction in consulting contracts. And third, other non-personnel and non-service related cuts. I am incredibly grateful and proud of the work that the agency presidents and their teams did. We gave them unreasonable goals and unreasonable timelines, and their smart, creative responses are unbelievably appreciated by everybody here, and frankly, customers don't know the details, but our customers should be as well. The other thing I'll say, Clayton, is that work continues, and I have every expectation that when we're done, it will exceed $600 million for sure. But we're continuing to work on it and continuing to reap more savings, and those steps would be put in place some this year and then beginning of 2021.
Two quick follow-ups.
Sure.
I mean, what consultant contracts are we talking about? What do they do? What do you rely on them for? Are you going to bring that work in-house? Like, can you give us a little bit more detail, particularly on the consulting end of this?
Sure. A big international consulting firm had a contract worth tens of millions of dollars. We haven't signed it. We've put it on pause. There are some we've terminated. I think what we will do is in the days and week or so down the road, we'll provide more detail on that. As I said, the 540, I have every reason to expect that when we're done, it'll be north of $600 million. And it's an incredible achievement in a relatively short period of time. And hats off to the agency presidents, to Bob Foran, Mario Peliquin, and everybody at the agencies, agency CFOs that's contributed to this.
Have you considered any salary cuts to yourself or any of the MTA's highest paid employees who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year?
The answer is yes, and that will be, as I've said before, that'll be part of the mix. Absolutely.
Next question is Dan Rivoli from New York One. Dan?
Hi. You're saying the MTA can't cut its way out of this, but cut you threaten to do. Is this a political maneuver by issuing this scope, this doomsday plan and scope? And do you think you have the votes on the board to go through with it, or do you do you think the board members who want the balanced approach, one, do they have a point, and two, are they going to prevail at the end?
So the answer to your first question is no, this is deadly serious. One doesn't talk about reducing subway bus service by 40% or 50% on the commuter rails. That's deadly serious. Unfortunately, these are the types of drastic, draconian actions we have to take as a result of pandemic-caused financial losses. So we are deadly serious. Look, I spoke about the balanced approach, and it's I don't think it makes sense under this circumstance. Having said that, we're agnostic as to sources of revenue. We are realistic about the city's financial condition. We're realistic about the state's financial condition and the financial conditions of the other 49 states, all of whom are going to be looking to the federal government for help. However, the federal government is the only agency, the only instrumentality of public purpose and policy that has the ability to deal with the issues across the country, but here at the MTA, it is only the federal government that will be able to solve this.
Well,
Commissioner, sorry, Dan. Commissioner Lacewell's comments are exactly right. This is an international and a national crisis. It was exacerbated by federal action and inaction, and it's incumbent upon the federal government to solve it.
I mean, to follow up, I understand the financial restraints states and localities are in, but this is more than just a blank check. Why is it so insurmountable that the only way out of this is aid? Why can't everyone pull together and come up with a plan that is more than just having an entity write the MTA a blank check?
Well, first of all, it's not a blank check. Let me explain to you the way the CARES funding worked and the way I expect any additional federal funding would work. One, the MTA was the first public transit agency in the country to exhaust its financing. That's thank you to the FTA in Washington and the FDA here in New York, one. Two, our need was greater. The decline in revenue that we experienced as a result of the fact New York was the epicenter of the pandemic led to extraordinary losses in revenues on the fare and toll side. Obviously, tolls have recovered in large part, and the decline in subsidies. And every week or two, we would go to the FTA and say, we expected to have $100 of fare and toll revenue on April 1st. Obviously, it's multiples of that. I'm using that as an example. And we didn't have $100. We had $40. And after having proved that, we would get reimbursed by the federal government. That's the way, that was perfectly acceptable to us. We exhausted the funding first. We have every expectation that the federal government will have disciplines and checks like that in place. And we operated successfully in terms of being able to demonstrate our losses. We'll be able to do that going forward. There's no blank check here.
And moving on to Steve Burns of CBS 880 Radio, who's been talking about transit since well before dawn this morning. Steve.
Tim, thank you very much. I was kind of struck by, I believe it was Larry Schwartz, who said this won't even achieve getting the MTA out of half the deficit that it needs to be taken out of. And ultimately, what is the purpose of floating these cuts and reductions if you're still left with most of the problem still in your hand? What happens to achieve all of the cuts that you need to get to here?
Well, Steve, I guess taking your theory and taking it to the absurd, right? We should just sit on our hands and wait for the federal government to come and not cut $540 million of consulting and overtime expense, and it shouldn't do anything to reduce the size of the problem. That's not a responsible approach. It's not one, obviously, that's going to be welcomed by any funders, including the federal government. We've got a responsibility to do something. What the conclusion of the cuts is that we cannot cut our way out of this. We're going to do everything we can to reduce the size of the issue for the MTA, the size of the challenge for the MTA, and for the federal government, but without federal funding on the order of the $12 billion that we discussed, we're not going to be able to get out of this box. And that's disaster.
And I was also struck by the almost political infighting that's already begun. We heard from the Rockland and Orange reps about west of Hudson service. We heard from John Samuelson that he wasn't going to give any concessions on the union side. How concerned are you about kind of the infighting that may result from such drastic actions here?
Well, look, it's not surprising to any of us that given the draconian steps that we outlined, that people in every part of the MTA service territory, from customers in Rockland County to subway customers to people on the Ronkonkoma Long Island Railroad platform to people waiting at White Plains Station to people waiting for an accessoride car to colleagues in Rockland County to labor leaders and their members, that there is dissatisfaction all around. That's completely understandable. As I said at the beginning, these are actions we do not want to take. And the only solution, the only practical solution, is federal funding at the levels we've discussed.
And next up is Jose Martinez of the city. Good afternoon, Jose. We could just unmute yourself over there at the city. That would be fabulous, Jose. There we go.
Got it. Hi, Pat. The MTA's real estate holdings, which are significant, is there anything that the agency can do with them in terms of finding some way out of this hole, or is that even just chump change?
We're looking at everything. We are looking at reducing the amount of space that we use, and see whether that can free up properties that could be that could be monetized. Those things are being looked at by Jano Lieber and his team in a serious way.
All right, next up is Danielle Moyo of Politico.
The thing I'd add is when we say everything's on the table, we mean everything's on the table, including disposing of real estate that we can figure out a way to make it surplus in whole or in part. Danielle.
Hi, I have two questions, if that's okay. My first is, I'm curious with congestion pricing if the MTA is thinking of taking any more drastic steps to try and get that moving. Some have raised potentially suing the federal government or just going forward with its own review. I'm just curious if that's, on the table right now.
Well, look, a lawsuit on this on the environmental holdup at U.S. DOT, I think, is likely to be lengthy, and don't know whether it would succeed. This is obviously a ministerial decision in the eyes of U.S. DOT. The thing that is paradoxical and cynical is that on a endeavor, Central Business District tolling, which is a huge environmental positive, that it's being held up for purported environmental reasons. It's the height of cynicism.
Gotcha. And then just my other question was more about looking kind of more in the future. Some have raised concern that we may never really see a full ridership rebound if, we still see a lot of our office workforce working from home 2 to 3 days a week. I'm curious just if the MTA is thinking about that and has thought about what it could do, or if the state or city should be, thinking of some ideas to try and get people moving on the subway, whether it's for work or other options, if you think that's a real concern here.
On that one, I'm with Jerry Seinfeld in his op-ed about nothing. I think we're very focused on ridership and the ridership decline. We are, we're doing a new campaign on Save Transit that if you haven't seen, you ought to go look at. What we're doing is providing service on facilities across the system where the vast majority of riders are wearing masks. That's the most important thing. Where the accessoride vehicles and buses and subways and commuter rail cars and stations have been disinfected multiple times the day before, and where an agency is looking at innovative steps to protect and minimize public health risks to employees and customers. We're doing all of that. We're talking regularly with large and medium-sized and small employers, the chambers of commerce in the boroughs, the business associations outside, obviously Kathy Wild at the partnership, and we're doing everything we can to make the case, including, it's important to note, that no place in the world on public transit that has gone through the pandemic has public, and ridership has increased significantly, has public transit been identified as the source of a cluster of outbreak of COVID-19. That's really important.
And next, with his finger on the unmute button, is the New York Post's own David Meyer. David. Evidently, his finger was on another key. If you could just hit the one that says unmute, David, we'll all be able to hear you. All right, tell you what. Look for that button while we go to Alfonso Castillo, who is at Newsday, with his finger on that unmute button. Alfonso, go ahead.
Hello, thanks for doing this, as always, Pat. A couple questions. I know you said that you're not ready to discuss specifics about the LIR's potential service cuts, but talking strategy, I know the document says that the busiest lines would have service reduced to hourly, less busy lines every 2 hours. So is it a fair assumption that the lines with the lowest ridership, West Hempstead, Oyster Bay, Greenport, would be the ones that would potentially be eliminated?
So, Alfonso, that's a not unreasonable scenario you've described. We're not in a position to speak to it because we haven't made those decisions. And as I said, we've got a number of priorities, and one of them, recognizing this is going to be incredibly disruptive for customers and employees. If we have to go down a road we don't want to go down. But we haven't made those decisions, and we'll be looking at all of those issues as we continue this analysis.
And then another question about a strategy. Up until a few months ago, the number you were talking about was $3.9 billion. I understand it's the difference between what you need this year and what you need this year and next year. But can you talk about that shift to $12 billion? It's a much bigger number and a bigger ask than the $3.9 billion. It even caught Senator John Liu off guard yesterday at the hearing as an unusually high number. Why go for that much rather than just what you need this year?
I'm going to call on the senator's debate partner from yesterday.
Look, the last thing we want to do is to have a partial solution that then will put us at risk of being at a fiscal cliff and not being able to address it. So we're looking to have an amount of money that will get us through this year into next year. And again, that $12 billion, I think, is an appropriate amount of money. It reflects the COVID losses that we suffered, potential revenue losses affecting the whole region that come to us as subsidies, and also it's $1 billion that we're not receiving in 2021 for congestion pricing. That's a very important amount of money for our capital program, and we're definitely not going to receive that because of the inaction in Washington.
All right, thanks, Bob. David Meyer says the New York Post has worked out the technical side. If we can do that, let's go back to David.
Can you hear me?
We do.
Awesome. So I was also struck by Commissioner Schwartz's comments regarding the math here. And I have two questions, Pat. One is there a scenario in which the system would be forced to shut down completely? And two, in order to close that, $7 billion gap there, how many layoffs would be required?
So, David, the service reductions that we outlined today, which we're not in a position to take to the board, and we continue to work on them, are themselves significant, drastic, draconian, and not something that anybody wants to do. Of course, the MTA is not going to shut down. Our goal is to get $12 billion in funding so that the draconian steps we described, including with respect to service and with respect to reductions in force do not have to happen. And again, what the numbers show, and I think every one of my colleagues on the board demonstrated, that the only way we can get to solving this problem is with $12 billion of federal money. There is no other alternative.
So if the problem isn't solved and that funding isn't received, the MTA can just keep operating and won't shut down? Trying to understand the severity of the situation.
Well, so the severity of the situation is extreme. The pandemic caused losses are beyond the capacity of this agency, and I'd argue any agency, for that matter, state, right? The MTA's deficit is higher than 90% of the states that participated in a survey with respect to their deficits. 90% of the states in 2020 and 90 or 89% of the states in 2021, according to that survey. There's no higher level of severity or emergency than the situation we're in.
And next up from Streets Blog is Dave Colon. Dave, good afternoon.
Oh, it's a great afternoon. Pat, to kind of follow up on what Danielle was talking about, you seemed a little hesitant to approach the idea of suing the DOT over the congestion pricing holdup because you said it's an administrative decision, it's all on them, they might get away with it. But why not just say, screw it, let's be legends and sue the DOT over this?
Yeah, David, the answer is we've considered it. We don't think it's a fruitful road to go down. We don't think it's going to we don't think it's going to change the result. And a new administration may take a different view. This administration may change its view, but we think a lawsuit would be fruitless.
And then kind of going, the route of outside of federal help. I don't know if you might have missed this. The governor also seems to agree you can't solve this with taxes alone, is something that he said earlier today, like a half hour ago. But if
David, sorry, the governor said, I didn't hear the first.
The governor said you can't solve this with taxes alone when he was talking about the MTA's budget hole. But if you and the board reach some kind of idea that would say reduce the service cuts potentially from 20% to 40%, I mean, how hard would you push him and the legislature on something like this? How hard will you fight for the state and city to get money in light of potential and seeming federal inaction?
Sorry, your question is how hard will we fight for the state and city to get federal funding?
No, if the federal government doesn't do anything, how hard are you going to push the city and state to, fill some of the gap?
And are you assuming a scenario in which the federal government has given money to the state of New York and the city of New York?
No, the one where they just aren't doing anything like they're doing now. So if we can go from, we have 40% service cuts on the table right now. If you can get it down to 20% service cuts, are you going to tell them you have to do this and we're going to not get off your back until you're willing to go along with us on this, on a gas tax, a sales tax, something?
So David, I noted before, and this is a kind of a major difference in the environment, right? In 75, when the city went broke, it was as a result of city overspending and lack of discipline, right? But the state was flush and the federal government was flush and the business community, it was a difficult time, but the business community had money and the union pension plans came to the rescue. There's no solvent government, frankly, in America right now, right? The state and the city effectively have no money, and the state faces a $15 billion deficit. And I don't know exactly what the latest New York City number is, but the city's talking about laying off 29,000 people. In that situation, the only place to go for funding is federal funding, because the state and the city are themselves seeking federal funding.
And next up is Michelle Kasky of Bloomberg. Michelle.
Hello, thank you for this press conference. I was hoping you would be able to give us an update on your liquidity. What's the amount? What is that made up of? Especially after the loan that you guys were able to take out last week. and with the Fed? And also, at what point have you mapped out when exactly you will run down that liquidity, given that you're losing $200 million a week?
So the last liquidity that we disclosed for the last offering, it was $5.8 billion. About $2.6 billion, $2.5 billion is in the general cash account. About $1.2 billion is what we call flexible monies. These are monies that have come through various transactions available primarily for our capital program, but which can be made available for operations, being loaned for operations. We have the $336 million OPEB that you saw earlier in the presentation. And then we have about $1.7 billion of undrawn lines of credit. Now again, the lines of credit have to be repaid if we draw them down. The flexible funds, unless we're going to take it permanently away from capital, we would want to restore that. But basically, those are the funds we have. Now, we are drawing down about $200 million a week, but as you saw, we do have plans this year, about $1.1 billion, $1.2 billion that we presented. And that's, again, what would be available from cost reductions, OPEB that we would use, and also using the lockbox monies.
So you could get through this calendar year, you're saying, even if the federal government didn't allocate more aid?
Well, getting through this fiscal year is not what we intend to do.
Right.
With that, we are looking for solutions, long-term permanent solutions, but we do have liquidity. But again, the idea would not be to completely draw down our liquidity without any solution, a viable solution on the other side.
We're going to move on to Christina Goldbaum of the New York Times. Christina. Okay. How about we move one more time to Paul Burton of Bond Buyer, and we will sort the rest. Paul.
Okay, this staying on the Fed's municipal liquidity facility, and this could be for either Pat or Bob. You folks got a better deal than Wall Street last week, but the rates were still high, and I'm wondering if there's been any discussions with maybe, say, Senator Schumer about getting the Fed to ease the terms a little bit further, which could provide a smidgen of relief not only for the MTA, but for some of the other transit agencies around the country that may consider joining this program.
So, Paul, I'm not smart enough to answer that question, and I'm going to refer it to Bob, but there are 2 points I do want to make. One is the MTA wants to express its gratitude to 2 people on the MLF. One is Senator Schumer for advocating with the Fed that agencies like the MTA be included, and second, Governor Cuomo for designating us as one of the 2 revenue bond issuers in the state of New York eligible to use the MLF, and then I'll defer to Bob for the rest.
Well, as you know, the Federal Reserve lowered the MLF rate by 50 basis points after there were questions raised about the level of that rate. Whether they choose to do that again, I don't know. But I will tell you that the flexibility that program offers, the fact that you can actually repay that if you need to at any time, there's no penalty to repay it, and the fact that it's a 3-year facility, we find attractive. So again, the Federal Reserve personnel were very easy to work with, and it's a program that we find very responsive to our needs.
And we're moving on to Paul Berger of the Wall Street Journal. Paul.
Hi, Pat, can you hear me?
Yes, Paul.
Hi. So I was just wondering, during the pandemic, the MTA has maintained almost 100% service level wherever possible in order to allow riders to practice social distancing and obviously to try to prevent the spread of the virus. These enormous service cuts that you're talking about, if you enact them, then isn't that going to lead to crowding on subways and buses and to the MTA actually making the pandemic worse?
So the answer to that is no, Paul, but the thing is your premise, I think, is faulty. We have not maintained 100% service throughout. And for instance, indeed today, Metro North is running 60% of service for 17% of customers. Sarah, do you want to speak to subways? Level of service you're running for 25% of pre-pandemic, forgive me.
Sure, absolutely. We're still running full service, and I would say we're running full service on subways, and we're running other than the overnight shutdown from 1 to 5, and then on buses we are running all the service that we can with the operators who are available, which is mostly full service. Every now and then we miss by a bit because of an operator shortage. That's where we are.
So Pat, I'll take your points on commuter rail, but as far as subways and buses,
well, no, I don't agree, right? So on the subways, we talked about a reduction up to 40%. The flip side of that means we're going to run at least 60% service, and we'd be running 60% service for about 25% of pre-pandemic customers. We're obviously going to make distinctions where it makes sense, and not all bus routes or subway lines are the same.
So wouldn't that be the prudent thing to do then?
Forgive me?
Wouldn't that be the prudent thing to do, given that ridership is so low and that the costs are so high? Yes, the federal government needs to give the MTA money, but with ridership so low, wouldn't it be prudent to reduce service to save money?
Well, so a couple of things. One is start with we don't want to do any of this, right? A. B, because of labor union picks, right, where workers pick their work, we're not able to make adjustments on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis. We're going to reassess the level of service across the agency after Labor Day. That doesn't mean the day after Labor Day. Whether we have to put into effect the draconian steps that we outlined today. So we're going to be right-sizing service where it makes sense. And that's one reason, for instance, on Metro North today, we're running 60% of service for about 17% of pre-pandemic passenger volumes.
We're going to circle back to the New York Times, where I'm advised the technical circumstances have been resolved, and Christina Goldbaum is waiting to ask you a question. Christina. All right, once.
Can you hear me?
We do now. Success.
Okay. Thanks. Hi, Pat. Two questions. First, and given that you're losing $200 million a week, why not, whether it's service cuts or something else, why not take more drastic steps now to try to cut down on spending or look more aggressively for other, possible new revenue streams and do that now and not wait until the end of the year for next year?
So Christina, we're not waiting till now. That's why we're running 60% service on Metro North. It's why we're running less than 100% service on the Long Island Railroad. We're not running full service on buses, although buses obviously have come back. They're in second place after bridges and tunnels. We're cutting expense $540 million. We're doing everything we can. We're going to right-size service after Labor Day, whether or not we enact the reductions in service, which no one here wants to do. No one wants to disrupt customers and disrupt employees, but if we have to do it, we will. And again, we're in active, robust, full-throated pursuit of federal funding.
Okay, and then I also want to talk a little bit about the shift in rhetoric. Back in April at the board meeting, you asked for $3.9 billion from the federal government. In more recent weeks, that's changed to $12 billion. The APTA is saying that all transit agencies across the country will need 32. I think a lot of people would agree that it's highly unlikely the MTA will get $12 billion from the federal government this year. So with that in mind, do you think it's fair to tell riders that they will likely see some version of the picture you painted today in the coming year?
Well, let me ask Bob again to talk about the $12 billion.
The $12 billion ask again represented $10.3 billion of lost revenue, passenger revenue and direct tax revenues attributable to the COVID pandemic. About $600 million also was the anticipated loss of additional subsidies coming in as state and city are affected. And then it's $1 billion for the congestion pricing revenues that we expected to come in 2021, which now definitely are not going to come in. So that in total is how you get to the $12 billion.
Yes, but didn't we know that back in April? So again, if you've asked, congressional leaders for this suddenly, 12 billion just over the summer and not at that point, what makes you think that you can get that 12 billion by the end of this year?
Well, look, Christina, the federal legislators and appropriators decided to provide us $3.9 billion in the CARES funding. We were incredibly gratified for that. It did not at the time satisfy our funding needs for the remainder of 2020, and certainly did not represent any portion of our funding needs in 2021. I think that was clear to everybody. And what we are doing is providing a candid explanation of what it is we need to get the MTA through the rest of this year and 2021.
Next up is Steve Nesson from WNYC. Steve, take it away.
Hey there. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Two questions. One is, have you briefed Gillibrand and Schumer about these doomsday scenarios, and what have they said? And also, can I just get you to explain a little bit what you mean by you're agnostic on the source of revenue? Because I don't think I understand what that means.
Okay, so on the first question is, yes, we've been in regular contact with both of our U.S. senators, including the minority leader and Senator Gillibrand, both of whom have been extraordinarily helpful. That's also true with respect to the New York congressional delegation. With respect to agnostic as to revenue sources, the point is all revenues are welcome. We need every dollar we can get, and whatever source it comes from, we will take it. The fact of the matter is, without kind of misleading anybody, including ourselves, in the current environment, given the fiscal situation of the state and the city, and every state and the city in the country that's been touched by the virus, the federal government is the funder of last resort, and it will be the funder of last resort for the MTA, or it will cause a huge disruption in the MTA's operation, its service in the region, and huge lasting damage to the economy of the New York City region, costing tens and hundreds of thousands of jobs.
So it's the last resort, but it's also the only resort that can actually provide $12 billion.
I think that's, to us, that's clear. We're going to do everything we can by controlling overtime, cutting consulting contracts, doing everything we can, and those things we are well along, and that work continues. The drastic steps we outlined today are ones that we don't want to take. No one here wants to do them. We realize the disruption it would cause to our employees and our customers, but we are laser focused on getting federal funding. There is no assurance of that, but we're going to play every card we can in terms of making the case that it is not only a good investment for New York, for the New York region, it's a good investment on a national basis that will pay real returns over a period of decades.
And we're wrapping up now with Ben Kabak, followed by Natalie of CBS and Clayton Goose. All right, so Ben, Second Avenue Sagas, you're up.
Thanks, Tim. Two questions, one related to the budget, one not. The first, the slides talk a lot about the net of expected revenue losses, which I understand means modeling that shows a ridership decline based on cuts to service and extreme fare hikes. Can you talk a little bit more about what the anticipated impact would be on ridership levels if these cuts go through? And then the second question I can ask after, it concerns the 24-hour shutdown, the service.
Yeah, we're not going to discuss that at this time. As we said, this was a first cut going through it, but we are recognizing that there will be revenue impacts because of fewer riders, and no one has looked at the elasticities of something this dramatic. So we can't say right now what the elasticity factor will be, but we do know that based on what we can determine, there will be significant revenue loss, and then we wanted to reflect those into the projections.
Thanks, Bob. And Pat, if I may, which elements of the overnight disinfecting would be impossible to accomplish if passengers were permitted back onto the trains that are still running overnight? Just curious to get a sense of how that would impact the overall risk of COVID-19 transmission on transit.
Oh, look, Ben, I'm not a public health expert, so I'm not going to speak to the risk of transmission. Not my world. The answer to your question from a transportation point of view was we would not be able to accomplish the level of disinfecting of subway cars and stations that we're able to accomplish now. That's why we put the closure in place, period.
And next up is Natalie Duddridge of CBS 2. Natalie, take it away.
Hi, yeah, just looking for a quick update on the subway broken windows. Riders that we spoke to are worried that it will impact service and fees, or they could be raised to cover repairs. And then also people are just wondering, the picture of this possible vandal is pretty clear. It's taking a long time to find this vandal or vandals.
Yeah, so we continue to be really frustrated by what we're seeing on the 7 line. You know, particularly at this moment in time, you know, this is the last thing our workforce needs. This is the last thing our ridership needs. And this is the last thing that any of those folks should be having to deal with. And it comes at a significant cost to riders and to taxpayers. Each of those windows is expensive, right? And in terms of a significant cost to riders, it's taking the train out of service for it to be repaired. And it's not just the 7 line. So these are the figures from last week. 152 cases of vandalism, 77 train car windows, 31 digital media screens, 20 MetroCard vending machines, 20 additional instances of graffiti. Every single one of those costs MTA money, which means it's costing taxpayer money, which means it's still going into our bottom line of challenges at the moment. And by the way, that's on top of 17 employee assaults. So we're quite frustrated with what we're seeing at the moment. You know, we had to take the some trains out of service yesterday in order to be repaired, and so that's a direct issue for 7 line riders. I can't speak to how long the potential perpetrator's face has been out there. I defer you to, you know, I would send you to the NYPD for that. We're obviously grateful for all the help that we're getting from them, and obviously very frustrated by this.
All right, Sarah, if you could just stay where you are. We've got Clayton Gusa to bring it home here this afternoon, again from the news. Clayton?
Hey, anyone can answer this, but I mean, Sarah and Pat, you guys have both dealt with, neither of you are shrinks, but you guys have both, you know, had enough experience in transit to deal with your fair share of wackos. What kind of person does this in your mind? What compels someone to continue to do this? I mean, there was another hit last night, as you know, and you guys put out a bounty and they continue to do it. So how would you describe the kind of person that does this? And I have one follow-up.
I mean, someone who does not care about their fellow New Yorkers. I mean, that's about as close as I can get to it.
Now, look, I'm not a behavioral psychologist either. I'm not going to speak to it.
Okay, and then Pat, real quick, I just wanted to see if you wanted to respond to the incident during the storm on the Verrazano Bridge earlier this month. I haven't had a chance to talk to you about it. You guys said that you did everything in your power to mitigate that and close the bridge, but 5 trucks tipped over in the wind. One truck driver is out of his livelihood. It's in shambles. What are you guys going to do next time to better prepare and better close the bridge when a storm like that hits?
Yeah, so protocols were followed. It was an extreme storm. Danny DiCrescenzo at TBTA is doing an after-action report, and I've asked Pat Warren, who's our Chief Safety Officer, to review that report. We're also going to reach out to the Port Authority, which has the same protocols, by the way, that the MTA does on bridges and tunnels, and see whether in extreme cases like this, different protocols ought to be put in place. I think we're acting appropriately given the extent of the storm, and that's the status.
All right, thanks. Thanks, everybody, and good afternoon from Lower Manhattan.